Torpedoes astern.
I'd say you four boys are up Fart Creek without a paddle.
Howdy folks, hope you're all having a good weekend, and welcome back to World of Warships with Rear Admiral Jingles. Before we get started, I'd just like to say that today's pre-intro sequence was tested on and approved by real Canadians. Now, moving on swiftly, today's battle features Conrad QD here in the Zhao, the Japanese Tier 10 heavy cruiser. Oh, and for those of you who might be wondering, hang on Jingles, what's going on here? What's been happening in your replays lately? Why can't we see the names of the ships, the players? Where are the team lineups? What's going on? Well, they managed to introduce a new bug since the last patch. This is what it defaults to every time you fire up a replay. You have to pause the game, go into the settings menu, head to controls, click all the checkboxes, activate the drop-down menu to give the full alternative battle interface every single time you launch a replay. Now this probably isn't a major problem for most of you, but trust me, if you watch as many replays as I do, this shit gets old very quickly. Anyway, Conrad QD here in the Zhao. And I think it's fair to say that the Zhao isn't nearly as popular a ship as it used to be. I mean, obviously it isn't. At one point there were only two Tier 10 cruisers in the game, this and the Des Moines. Now there are obviously a whole lot more, so there's a whole lot more to choose from, but while the Des Moines has definitely remained a very popular pick at Tier 10, thanks to its good radar, its decent armour for a cruiser, and the insane rate of fire of its 8-inch guns, the Zhao has not. I still think the Zhao's a good ship, and it hasn't changed, it's just that the game has moved on. What the Zhao used to bring to the party was devastating, hard-hitting, long-range, high-explosive firepower. It is still a good ship for knocking chunks out of your opponents at long range with devastating high-explosive salvos and setting lots and lots of fires. But while that's no bad thing to be good at, the Zhao isn't exactly unique in that regard. In fact, I'd argue that the Hindenburg does the same thing, except better, because while the Zhao's high explosive shells do hit pretty damn hard, it only fires every 13.7 seconds. The Hindenburg can do the same thing twice as quickly. Also, the Zhao's survivability is not great. She's got the lowest health of all of the Tier 10 heavy cruisers, and in fact she even has lower health than some of the Tier 10 light cruisers. Her armour is serviceable, but any battleship armed with 429mm or higher guns can overmatch her, and while her citadel is reasonably well protected, again it's nowhere near as well protected as other Tier 10 heavy cruisers like the Hindenburg. The Zhao's not a bad ship, it's just that, well, the game's moved on since she was a really, really good ship, and now she's just okay. Nevertheless, what Conrad is doing here is basically what the Zhao is good at: kiting at extreme range and working those guns. Although you do need to watch out, because the uncomfortable firing angles on the turret mean that you will be exposing an uncomfortable amount of ankle in order to get all four of the turrets firing. So you do need to be very careful when you're kiting away from battleships and raining down, oof, that could have been nasty, large chunks of high explosive death and destruction on their heads at extreme range. One thing that does help the Zhao play like this is its very good speed by cruiser standards. Its default speed is, I believe, 34.5 knots, which is pretty fast for a cruiser. Slap a speed flag on it and you're probably looking at 35 plus. So that's not bad. Like I said, the Zhao is not a bad ship. There's just nothing remarkable about it anymore. It doesn't do any one thing better than anyone else. Then again, it doesn't do anything particularly badly either. I mean, most people playing the Zhao will be focusing on firing the high explosive shells because that's going to get you the most bang for your buck, but, well, at ranges of, oh, I don't know, 8 kilometres or less, if you've got a nice broadside target to shoot at, even a battleship, the armour-piercing shells do a huge amount of damage too. And both the high explosive and armour-piercing shells have very good ballistic performance, with very high muzzle velocity of 920 metres per second. So this means that unlike other ships that like to spam rapid-fire volleys of high explosive at enemy battleships, yes, USS Worcester, I'm looking at you, the Zao shells get there in a reasonable time, which means you're rewarded for accurate firing in a way that isn't really practical in something like the Worcester, because the shells float all the way to the target, giving the target plenty of time to dodge. The Worcester succeeds just by sheer volume of fire, but the Zao doesn't have that with a 13.7 second reload. And accuracy, which the Zao has, is important in a ship with a slow reload. There's nothing more demoralising, and I'm looking at ships like the USS Kansas and the Gneisenau and the Tirpitz and the Bismarck and basically any tier 7 or higher, except for the Scharnhorst German battleship. There's very little more demoralising than being forced to wait out a lengthy reload, then firing everything you have at the enemy and watching the shells go wherever they like. The good accuracy and the excellent shell ballistics mean that as long as you're aiming properly, you do tend to hit what you're firing at, even if you do have to wait quite long between shots by cruiser standards. At the minute, Conrad is pretty much in his element here. He's in pursuit of the Izumo, and the Izumo is basically buggered because he's not fast enough to get out of range and go undetected, and his guns aren't high enough caliber to be able to overmatch the Zao's bow armour and citadel in from the front. And also it's an Izumo, all of his guns are in the front, which means if you're running away from somebody, you can't shoot back at them anyway. So that was a good situation for Conrad to be in, and he exploited it perfectly. But arguably, I'd say that the Zao is in a far, far superior position when the tables are turned, and the Zao is the one running away from superior enemy numbers. Anyone who's ever been in the unfortunate situation of having to try to chase down a Zao that's kiting away from you will know exactly what I'm talking about. And in fact, I'd say this is the one thing that the Zao does even better than the Hindenburg. And it's not just because of the Zao's speed, which makes it extremely difficult to try to catch up with one. And it's not just because of the Zao's better than average stealth, which means that you never know exactly where the ship you're chasing is until it's decided to shoot at you. But even if the Zao captain elects to not shoot at you and instead stay hidden, this is probably where it's at its most dangerous, particularly if you're chasing after it at full speed. Try to find the sneaky little bugger, because the Zao has torpedoes. Very, very nasty torpedoes. It's got 2 launchers on each side. Each launcher can put 5 torpedoes into the water, and so, say it with me, maths fans, yep, 20 torpedoes. There are destroyers that can't do that. In fact, I don't think there's a destroyer that can do that. And these are not any old torpedoes either. These are Japanese torpedoes. And the Japanese had very, very good torpedoes. The Zao can choose from either the Type 93 Mod 3 torpedoes, which have a 12-kilometre range, or the Type F3 torpedoes, which have an 8-kilometre range. Still 2 kilometres better than the torpedoes on the Hindenburg. The Type 93s have a speed of 67 knots and do more than 23,000 damage. The F3s have a speed of 76 knots. And they don't do quite as much damage, but they still do more than 21,000. So picture this. You're chasing down a Zao. It's kiting away from you at 35 knots. You don't have a prayer of actually catching up with it, but what you might catch up with are a set of 20 F3 torpedoes heading back in your direction with a potential closing speed of, well, in excess of 100 knots. Good luck dodging those. And woe betide anybody, particularly in a cruiser, but even in a battleship, who assumes that the Zao captain doesn't know how to do anything but spam high explosive, because if you give the Zao the chance, they'll deliver an extremely nasty armour-piercing enema as well. Switching back to the high explosive here, obviously, now that the Nevsky is kiting away. But I don't think he's going to be able to kite away fast enough. Friendly carriers' rocket planes are going in. Actually, speaking of rocket attack planes, there's something about rocket attack planes that I've been meaning to talk about for a couple of days now, and this is as good an opportunity as any. So, do you recall the Tashkent video from, I think it was last Tuesday? The captain of that Tashkent was Moggy2 from the North American server. And he's started a very interesting topic on the North American forums, talking about the impact, whether intended or not. Ooh, bye-bye Nevsky. That the recent change in rocket attack plane mechanics has brought to the game in general. Because I've been moaning about the lack of presence of, well, cruisers in general and light cruisers in particular at tiers 8, 9 and 10. I feel like the game's just been dominated by battleships and carriers for so long that it's starting to get a bit silly. And, well, not just battleships and carriers, the sudden proliferation of what wargaming are calling supercruisers started with ships like the Stalingrad. Then we got ships like the Yoshino and the Azuma and the Alaska. And lately it feels as if wargaming are introducing a new supercruiser every month. And then, of course, suddenly the battleships all start getting into an arms race. Suddenly just having 16-inch guns isn't good enough anymore. And we're seeing all of these new battleships arriving with 18-inch guns, and just when we thought that was bad enough, now we're getting battleships armed with 20-inch guns. And let's not forget all of the carriers with their armor-piercing rockets. Essentially a flying heavy cruiser able to deliver 8-inch armor-piercing rocket broadsides from whatever angle they like because they're an aircraft and you're not. I think it's safe to say that it's not that surprising that you don't see many people playing, well, cruisers in general and light cruisers in particular at tier 8 and higher. And those few cruisers that you do see tend to overwhelmingly be the new supercruisers armed with at least guns of 305mm in caliber. And then wargaming changed the way rocket attack planes work. So for those of you who maybe don't play World of Warships and just watch my videos on the subject, and there's a surprising amount of you out there who fall into that category, the way rocket attack planes used to work was, well, simple even by an arcade game like World of Warships standards. The carrier simply put the cursor over the target or slightly ahead of it, pressed the button, and half a second later the target got hit by a deluge of high explosive rockets. And this was really bad news if you were in a destroyer, because it wasn't unusual to see destroyers lose, well, half or more of their health pool in a single rocket attack. It was pretty cataclysmic if you were in a destroyer, and it wasn't a whole lot of fun if you were in anything else either. Well, wargaming just changed the way the rocket attack aiming mechanics work. What happens now is you put the cursor ahead of the target, you click the button, and for a couple of seconds the aircraft strafe the target with their machine guns. Now this doesn't do any actual damage, but it paints a picture for the target of exactly where those rockets are about to go, giving them time to get out of the way. It took them 2 years, but just dodging is now actually a viable defensive tactic against aircraft carrier rocket attack planes. So now, and I accept that I am oversimplifying things a little here, but it was a fairly major change, destroyers are actually able to play the game instead of shouting, "Help, I'm being oppressed, come see the brutality inherent in the system." Alright Jingles, what does this have to do with Moggy2's North American forum post? Well, I'm getting to that now. Moggy2 started a forum topic on the North American forums entitled "The Wider Impact of the Rocket Fighter Changes on the Game," where he analysed the populations of the different classes before and after the change, and he noticed some trends. Battleship population is down a lot across all of the servers. Cruiser population is up a little, destroyer population is up a lot, carrier population hasn't changed. Moggy2 suggested that this one simple change has actually led to a massive improvement for the game as a whole. The destroyers aren't feeling quite so oppressed, so they're now playing in greater numbers, and because the carriers are having a harder time deleting the destroyers, they're shifting their attentions towards the battleships, who are already feeling pretty nervous with higher than average numbers of destroyers around, so there are now less battleship players. Because there are less battleship players, the cruisers are finally creeping back out of hiding. Because we're seeing more cruisers rather than teams consisting entirely of battleships and destroyers, the cruisers are able to help keep the numbers of destroyers in check, but because we've got these faster, more lightly armed ships able to exploit the flanks, we're just seeing less static gameplay. And all of this because wargaming changed the way that rocket attack planes worked in order to take some of the oppression off the destroyer players. At least that's the conclusion that Moggy2 comes to, but I have to disagree. I think he's right in almost every respect. I think seeing more cruisers in the game, and when I say cruisers, I mean, actual cruisers, not ships like the Alaska, the Stalingrad, the Kronstadt, not the battle cruisers, actual cruisers, light cruisers, heavy cruisers. I think seeing more of them in the matchmaker is refreshing and is promoting less static gameplay. But I don't think Wargaming introduced this rocket fighter change in order to take the pressure off destroyer captains. Destroyers have been suffering from carrier repression for 2 years now since the carrier rework. I mean, Wargaming have made small incremental changes here and there which made it marginally less horrible to play a destroyer, but they've never done anything as big as this, which has firmly tilted the carrier meta, if you like, away from concentrating rocket attacks on very small and hard to hit targets. So, what changed that prompted this? Well, I don't think it's a question of what has changed. I think it's a question of what is about to change. Because I don't think that Wargaming did this to benefit the destroyer players. I mean, it has been a benefit to the destroyer players, obviously, and I completely agree with Moggy2's forum post that it has had a very refreshing and beneficial change on the game as a whole. But I believe Wargaming made this change to rocket attack planes to be a benefit to submarines. Because that's the thing that's changing. Submarines are coming to the game, and I don't think it's a coincidence at all that this change to rocket attack planes is happening just before the introduction of submarines. Because think about it. If a destroyer can lose half or more of its 20 to 30,000 health in a single strike from a rocket attack plane squadron, what about a submarine that only has 15,000 health to begin with? You just have a think about that, while Conrad does his level best to try to save this game. Lucky to not take more damage than that from the Attigo, who was firing on piercing as he came around the corner, but the Attigo kind of turned the wrong way, ran aground and was completely unable to avoid those torpedoes. Immelmann's torpedo planes coming in, but from ahead, the worst possible angle, and there's a very, very convenient Zao-shaped gap in the torpedo spread there, so he's able to completely avoid that. But now he's got bigger problems. The Immelmann's aircraft are coming in from the correct side this time, and if he turns to give broadside to that North Carolina, it will delete him. The Zao's torpedoes are good, but they fire in the rear arc, and oh, the Immelmann dropped his torpedoes too short, so only 2 of them hit. He cannot turn to torpedo the North Carolina without getting blatted out of existence by its 16-inch guns, but what he can do is torpedo the Immelmann. The Zao's rear-facing torpedo tubes can make that shot. And he does get the torpedoes away, all 10 of them, and he's almost certainly going to die now, if not by the North Carolina or the Vampire 2 on his port flank, then it was in fact by the Immelmann's dive bombers. And of course he was spotting everybody, so now they've all gone undetected. But he does get the Immelmann, and that kill was crucial. That kill will win the game as long as Conrad's carrier is smart. You see, there's only 3 minutes of this game left, and Conrad's team are 200 points ahead. So as long as the Midway stays alive, there's no way the enemy team can win. And now the Midway actually has a fighting chance of staying alive because Conrad took out the enemy team's eyes and ears. He sank the carrier. So it's now down to the Vampire 2 to locate and sink, or at least spot, the Midway so the North Carolina can sink it. And the Midway, and I've got to give this guy credit, knows exactly what it is that he has to do. He's heading for cover, as far away as possible from the last known reported positions of the 2 surviving enemy ships, the Vampire 2 and the North Carolina. And he's sending his dive bombers to make life as interesting as possible for that Vampire 2 and slow him down. But the Vampire 2 isn't exactly making things difficult for the Midway, is he? He's so desperate to not leave the cap circle that he's actually reversing and is basically a sitting duck. The Midway is never going to allow him to flip that cap. The Vampire needs to be heading straight for the Midway's position and spotting him, because they're not going to win this by capping. Conrad's team are just too far ahead on points. The Vampire has finally taken the hint, and he's heading in the direction of the surviving carrier. The North Carolina could slip into the central cap and flip that while still staying in shooting range of the Midway, but the Vampire has to spot him. And he's doing absolutely everything he can to avoid going after and spotting that Midway. So while the Vampire is busy doing his level best to lose this match, The introduction of submarines into World of Warships and the recent change to carrier rocket attack plane firing mechanics. I don't think it's any coincidence whatsoever that there is now a delay between clicking on the target and the rockets actually striking home, and I will eat my own arse if that delay is not long enough for a submarine to realise that it's about to get bombed and then dive successfully. I think the only coincidence here is that this change benefits destroyers as well, and has therefore also had a refreshingly beneficial effect on the game at large, in my opinion, although your mileage may of course vary. Yeah, that vampire has left this way too late. Looks like the North Carolina has some shots in the air. Or is that the vampires? No, those are the vampires, aren't they? Those are the North Carolinas. Ooh, that was close. Close. But no cigar. Thanks pretty much to Conrad. Taking one for the team there, but ensuring that he took out the enemy carrier. The Midway is able to successfully hide, run the clock down, and quite easily win this game on points. Well done, Conrad, and everybody let me know what you think in the comments about my little theory regarding rocket attack planes, mechanics changes, and the upcoming introduction of submarines to the game. Am I being paranoid? Do I need to put my tinfoil hat back on? Or maybe I've got something here, and does it even matter as long as it's beneficial to the game as a whole? Have your say in the comments. In the meantime, as always, take care, stay safe, and I'll catch you next time.